Hi everyone, I'm Anahi,
And I'm Olivia.
and this is our first full episode of So You Grew Up in the Suburbs. So this first episode is called A Suburban Youth's Guide to Black Lives Matter, and Olivia and I want to take the time to fully acknowledge that we in no way are experts on this subject, but we want to serve as a platform for people to ask questions, get some basic information, and think about these issues from a different perspective. So to give you a format of how this podcast is going to run, we plan to present you with some information first, have an interview with a Midwestern suburban youth who happens to be our friend Jared that we went to high school with, and then to take questions to an expert. In this case, it's Mr. Nimrod Chappell, president of the Missouri NAACP chapter.
And like Anahi said, we are not here to necessarily put our voices or our opinions in. We might interject them here and there, but our segment is based on facts that we have researched and an outline that we figured was kind of logical for any person that wants the history or wants to know more about Black Lives Matter.
Yeah. So to start off, I would like to talk about a really, basic place to start. What is Black Lives Matter? So Herstory of Black Lives Matter. And all of this information is taken directly from their website. So Black Lives Matter was founded in 2013 after the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer, George Zimmerman. And he was acquitted on the Stand Your Ground law, which I also want to note that we have here in Missouri because it'll come up later in this episode. But Black Lives Matter is a global mission. So it's not just based here in the United States, even though it started here. It is focused on a global scale. So it was created by three radical Black organizers, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi. And it has 40 chapters and is a member-led organization. Now, this particular attribute of Black Lives Matter is very important because it's described in the documentary 13th as a great model because it's a phenomenon with no address, no one leader that can be killed off, such as the leader of the Black Panthers, Fred Hampton. And here's a quote from their website that really states their mission very well. Black Lives Matter is an ideological and political intervention in a world where Black lives are systematically and intentionally targeted for demise. It is an affirmation of Black folks' humanity and our contributions to the society and our resilience in the face of deadly oppression, taken directly from their website. And Black Lives Matter also focuses on other humans other than cisgender heterosexual men. In a statement from their website, it says, as a network, we have always recognized the need to center the leadership of women and queer and trans people. So this organization emphasizes intersectionality, which is something that obviously needs to be addressed and advocated for more often. So you're probably wondering, what's their mission? Their mission is, as described from their website, an inclusive group, to create an inclusive group that wants to see past the nationalism and bring all Black communities to the front. They affirm all Black lives on the gender spectrum, and they affirm Black communities' humanity and their contributions to society and resilience in the face of deadly oppression. Their goal, as they describe on their website, is we are working for a world where Black lives are no longer systematically targeted for demise.
So to give some backstory and just some more information about Black Lives Matter, as Anahi described, this was founded in 2013 in response to the acquittal of his murderer, George Zimmerman. So I'm going to talk first about Trayvon Martin and what happened that day in February of 2012. So George Zimmerman was 30 years old at the time and called 911 because he claimed to have seen a suspicious person. This person was Trayvon Martin, who was 17 years old, and he was wearing a hoodie and had a backpack and was just coming back from 7-Eleven. He had Skittles and Arizona tea in his backpack. George Zimmerman admits to shooting 17-year-old Trayvon Martin out of self-defense, and then the Sanford Police Chief Bill Lee refused to, or just didn't open up a case because there wasn't enough evidence to prove that it was out of self-defense or it was not out of self-defense. One of Zimmerman's 9 calls to 911, he was instructed to not follow the boy that he was concerned with, but he still does. And you can hear help, help in the background, which we don't know is from who is coming from either Zimmerman or Trayvon Martin. During the incident, Trayvon was on the phone with his 16-year-old girlfriend at the time of the shooting. The girl, who wanted to remain anonymous, says she heard someone ask Martin what he was doing and heard Martin ask why the person was following him. The girl then got the impression that there was an altercation in which the earpiece fell out of Martin's ear and the connection went dead. Upon this evidence, Zimmerman was charged with second-degree murder, and his wife was charged with perjury. And then also the Sanford Police Chief, Bill Lee, is fired because of his initial unwillingness to open a case. So, in response to all of this, one of the protest instances that I wanted to talk about were the Dream Defenders, which was a group that they sat outside of the Florida... Oh, what was it?
Was it the state capitol building?
Okay, hold on. Yeah. Occupied the Florida State Capitol building for 31 days. They documented all of it on YouTube. And this was a huge moment in time for this to have happened because people then started to mobilize with the power of social media. And I think that that is very key in a lot of this gaining interest and, you know, reaching people that it wouldn't have reached regardless, because I, as a white person, don't have to worry about things like this, and I don't have, you know, I wasn't raised to be aware of things like this.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it would have reached me had it not reached social media. So I think that's really important. And also, you know, in reference to Black Lives Matter, the organization, they were also able to mobilize via social media in the same way, you know, any protest, any of that nowadays. So I think that that's just important to mention. I also wanted to talk about Ferguson, which is a town in Missouri where we live and where we are from.
Mm-hmm.
And this is important, one, for, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement and protests also, but also just shows that, you know, what we're talking about happens where you live. It happens in your backyard. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it happens even when people don't protest or have a hashtag about it. It happens all the time.
Yeah.
So the Ferguson protests and uprisings were in response to the death of Mike Brown Jr., who was 18. In 2014, he was shot by a white 28-year-old Ferguson police officer, Darren Wilson. There were a lot of back and forth of how it all went down. You know, who grabbed who first, you know, who shot first, and this and that. But when it comes down to it, and also there was a witness, which was Dorian Johnson, Mike Brown's friend, who was 22 years old. She saw everything happen. And Officer Darren Wilson would claim one thing, that, you know, Mike Brown approached him, and then Dorian Johnson would then claim that no, the officer came up to them first. So there was, you know, a lot of discrepancy in there. Regardless, Wilson shot Mike Brown multiple times until Brown fell to the ground. And the entire altercation, Wilson fired a total of 12 bullets, including 2 during the struggle in the car, that initial altercation. The last was probably the fatal shot. Brown was struck 6 times, all in the front of his body. Mm. This is where the hands up, don't shoot phrase comes from, just this instance, because it was said by a bystander that Mike Brown had his hands up the entire time and was still being shot at.
Right.
This has not been proven, and I think is actually is something that wasn't necessarily true about the instance, or that someone had reported it falsely, or that it wasn't something that really happened. However, this has been a huge part of any protest you go to, you know, especially for Black Lives Matter and stuff. That is something that is said,
yeah,
because it symbolizes the innocence of Black people,
right,
and the power of the police officer in that situation.
Right.
So, in response to this, a grand jury was called and given extensive evidence from Robert McCullough, the St. Louis County prosecutor, in 2014. And McCullough announced that the St. Louis County grand jury had decided not to indict Wilson. So, March 2015, the U.S. Department of Justice reported the conclusion of its own investigation and cleared Wilson of civil rights violations in the shooting. It found forensic evidence supported on Wilson's account and that witnesses who had corroborated the officer's account were credible. Witnesses who had incriminated him were found to be not credible, with some admitting they had not directly seen the events, which was the hands up, don't shoot, actually.
Yeah.
The U.S. Department of Justice concluded that Wilson shot Brown in self-defense. And that's how that ended. So what came out of that, I think, is important to note, is that the Ferguson uprisings, I was 15 when they were happening.
Yeah.
You were 14?
14, yeah.
I remember seeing it on the news. The uprisings were every night for, I think, over a week.
Yeah.
I remember seeing it on the news. I don't know if we saw it more since it was in Missouri. And that was a big deal.
Yeah.
But it was definitely receiving national news. It was huge. I mean, fire, loot.
Yeah.
And at the time, I did not understand, nor did I really try to understand what was going on. However, looking back, I can completely understand the feelings, the emotions of everything at that time. I just can't imagine. The people of Ferguson were lashing out back at the Ferguson police because of their history of white supremacy, and that was the final straw. And they were like, we're fed up. So that was kind of the blueprint, I think, for protesting and people kind of being like, yeah, we are upset.
Right.
And we're going to do something about it.
Right.
In regards to the Black Lives Matter movement. And that, to me, was, one of the first times I really
came into contact with it.
Black Lives Matter as the hashtag and as the movement and all of that. And that became something that was important in people that I knew. Yeah.
And, that happened in 2014. But, I mean, you look on Twitter and you see that picture of that woman holding the gun at protesters. And that was in St. Louis. Yeah. So it's still happening. Yeah. And it's still happening here in Missouri in places, Ferguson is not that far outside of the city of St. Louis. Yeah. So, yeah. Thank you for covering that. Yeah. So when we talk about Black Lives Matter and these instances with police, it's important to know the history of police. So I'm going to present some basic information from two very different articles, and I think it's really important to notice the different narratives between the first two articles, primarily that the North was good and the South was bad. So the first article I looked at was called How the U.S. Got Its Police Force from Time Magazine by Olivia B. Waxman. And this article talks about how police as we know it have not always been in existence since the birth of the nation, and that in colonial times it was actually a very informal system and it was an overnight system. But as the nation grew, it took on different forms in every state. And the North's purpose for police was primarily to safeguard businesses' goods during transportation from ports. So you can start to see the narrative of the North was the better side of the two and the South was bad, because then it talks about how this particular police took on a different form in the South. And the purpose of the police in the South was to capture runaway slaves. And it started with slave patrols. And the first slave patrol was created in 1704 in the Carolinas. And although this era of slave patrols took a break during the Civil War because the main form of policing was the military, during Reconstruction, this slave patrol regained force, where they were, as Gary Potter, the historian that's interviewed, says, that these slave patrols enforced segregation and the disenfranchisement of freed slaves. So we see that this patrol that eventually evolves into police was aimed at enforcing segregation and disenfranchisement, which, if you don't know what disenfranchisement means, that means prohibiting someone of their rights, specifically the right to vote. So the definition of what public order meant was different based on who you asked. And we're kind of making a little bit of a jump here in history from Civil War to the late 19th century. But in the late 19th century, businessmen had connections to politicians and knew who would be most likely to go on strike. And so because the police captains in the late 19th century were typically picked by a politician, this influenced who they deemed as dangerous and who they didn't. And obviously the people that they deemed as dangerous were the people going on strike. So they were then able to antagonize those that were not in agreement with their political parties, and then, somehow ignore the law breaking committed by people that were in their political parties. So, as I said, the people that were deemed dangerous were people that went on strike and labor union workers. And so the police were forced to keep these people groups down. And these people that were deemed different at the time were Irish, Germans, Catholic, Italians, and Eastern European immigrants. And so this led to the dominant culture, the majority, to have, their own sense of law and order as they defined it, which we all know means that it was based on the status quo, not on actual right and wrong. So all this to say that the police are new and have been based on racism since they began. So this was from a Time article magazine. And, I have always thought that Time magazines was pretty credible, and they are, but it's just interesting to see how deeply embedded this narrative of the North was good, the South was bad, has been present in our history. But when you start to look at some different material from academia, particularly this article from Eastern Kentucky University, you see a different narrative. So this article is called A Brief History of Slavery and the Origins of American Policing by Victor E. Kapler. And right off the bat, Kapler says, slave patrols and police departments, which later became police patrols, were both designed to control the behaviors of minorities. And I think that's a really bold statement to say, and that's important to note that an academic professor said that. And so this article also states that the St. Louis Police Patrol was founded to protect the residents from Native Americans. Again, if you're from Missouri and you think that this is something that wasn't happening here, it was, and it was happening in St. Louis. So this article also notes how after the Civil War, we started to see more groups of vigilantes, i.e. the KKK, and these groups were famous for lynching. Now, this brings up an important piece of legislation. In 1871, Congress passed the Ku Klux Klan Act that prohibited state actors from violating the civil rights of citizens, particularly because of law enforcement's involvement with the group. So this was essentially to get rid of the KKK, and it declared them as a terrorist organization. But as found from History.com, the Ku Klux Klan Act passed by Congress, it was later deemed unconstitutional in 1882. So that's something just to keep in mind as far as the KKK being considered a terrorist organization. And in the third article that I looked at, it's called The Racist Roots of American Policing, From Slave Patrols to Traffic Stops by Connie Hassett Walker. So first, it talks about the history in relation to what we have now, and it talks about something that's a little bit familiar with something we've seen recently in regards to police brutality, in that members of the slave patrols could enter anyone's home at any time based on the suspicion that they were housing a slave. And Walker also notes that it was a class issue. So Walker finds from her research that many of the people in the early police force were white males with little training and were supposed to investigate a dangerous underclass from the criminologist Gary Potter. So we're seeing that the police were not only based on racism, but also based on the narrative that poor people are bad. And so something else to note is that there have always been bigger setbacks to the advancements made for Black people. For instance, when the Civil War ended, they then instilled the Black Codes. And after that, when the 14th Amendment was first instilled, there was then the Jim Crow laws intended to set back the previous advancements. This article also mentioned a Washington Post poll, which tracked Americans that were killed by police based on race, gender, and other characteristics. It found that in 2018, 229 of the 992 who were tracked were Black, which is 23% of the total, but Black people only make up 12% of the country, And so as we can see, it's very disproportionate. So another thing that is important to note about the police and how they have been able to remain such a big part of society is the fact that they use fear. So from the get-go in 1865, there was terror being used against black people because white people were mad that black people were no longer slaves. And so the lynchings started happening, and lynchings of innocent black people. And the examples of things that black people just happened to be doing before they were lynched, which was found from the Equal Justice Initiative video called Terror Lynching in America, it lists really mundane things such as accidentally bumping into a white woman or reprimanding white children for throwing rocks at a black woman and for simply being a black taxi driver. And so another thing to note is the psychological aspects of the police and what they're wearing. So from this article that I looked at called Mere Sight of a Gun Makes Police and Public More Aggressive, experts say, by Alan Uhas, it talks about how the sight of weapons creates something called the weapons effect, where after seeing weapons, people are more likely to act aggressively. And an Ohio State University psychology professor, Brad Bushman, found that we can identify guns as fast as we can identify snakes and spiders, which is interesting. And I know from personal experience of protesting and attending protests that seeing the body armor and the shields is terrifying first and foremost. But there is something a little bit annoying about it, and I can see totally why it would stimulate aggression, because you're expected to go to this protest and be peaceful, and then you are met by police officers who are in full body armor and with masks, and the way that they're dressed is not intended for peaceful protests. It's intended for violence.
They have specific gear that they put on. But I do want to say that, of course, it didn't stimulate much aggression because the protesters weren't using like physical aggression towards them.
Right.
At least here in Kansas City.
Right.
I mean, the things that were thrown at police officers include a water bottle. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you can't count how many times that they used tear gas, rubber bullets, mace, on protesters.
Right.
So you're probably wondering, how are they paying for all of this? What is their budget like? Well, it goes by city, and I decided to look into, obviously, Kansas City's budget for police and overall budget. You can find city budgets and breakdowns on the internet and anywhere you are. I just went to kcmo.gov, and it's right there, PDF, boom, got it. It's also little hard to read, but that's just me. Okay, but anyways, so we have here just a few examples and services and departments that you would recognize. And I'm going to give you their budget and then in comparison to police. So housing services get about $25 million, health and medical care about $31.7 million. Parks and Recreation, about $70 million. Public Transit, about $74 million. Fire, about $194.5 million. And police get $272,865,765. This is from the 2020 budget. So,
wow.
While this isn't like a overall, this isn't every single department and the entire breakdown, it does show you that police are the single department, or
that's the most funded,
that gets the most money. Yes, and anything you look at. So, you can also look at individual departments within the police, what they're spending their money on, things like that. I think it's just important that everyone knows that resource is out there, and it would be hard to go through all of that information right now, but we're going to talk about training, because that's something that a lot of people bring up, and they're like, well, maybe police should be better trained, maybe they need more training, and so I looked up for Missouri our training requirements, and you can find any state's training requirement in the United States. I went to apexofficer.com is where it was. So Missouri actually has more extensive training requirements. So 2 hours per year they have a mental health training requirement. De-escalation training requirement for 2 hours per year. They need at least 24 hours a year of other required trainings, such as 1 hour of racial profiling, 2 hours mental health, 2 hours officer well-being, 2 hours implicit bias recognition, 2 hours de-escalation, and 2 hours of firearm, I'm guessing like accuracy. It's not very specific. Yeah. So this is one of the, like I said, most extensive. However, if you look at like Alabama, Alaska, they say the same thing. So no de-escalation training required. Other required training includes, 12 hours per year plus firearm proficiency. For Alabama, excuse me. So it's kind of just like a generic, like 12 hours per year, some sort of required training within your department or whatever. Yeah. And then, Alaska's even less. No de-escalation training required. Other required training, none, except firearm proficiency training is required. So that information is available again to the public. Just take a look if you would like. But I did want to say that Missouri is probably one of the most extensive, and when you look at that, I mean, I would have to look at the years and the timeline of all of those trainings being put in there. But I think that it's probably in response to Ferguson, or at least just people knowing about that specifically. It's as a state, they kind of went into more requirements. And you look at like California, they kind of have the same sort of training requirements,
but they've had tons of issues
but
too.
LAPD is like a big thing, but I mean NYPD, they don't have hardly anything, so it's just interesting to take a look at. And also, I mean, training is expensive. Like I'm gonna complain about them having too much money, but if you're calling for more requirements, more trainings, that's gonna cost money. That's gonna cost people, resources, time, all of that. So just think about that when you talk about defunding the police. It's, I guess, allocation of budgeting and resources, but also what are you asking for? What are you requiring? And do you know how much it costs?
Yeah, and, like we mentioned before, a lot of these government budgets, they try to spend as much money as possible so that way their budget doesn't get cut. Because the money that you don't spend is money cut from your budget. So that's something, it's very interesting and important to note. And like what you said about these other states saying that they require firearm training but no other training, I mean, it basically shows you that they value you being able to fire the gun more than they do anything else, which is, that's interesting.
And I feel like things like implicit bias training, racial profiling, mental health, things like that, all look really great on paper. Obviously, I think that those are important. You can't force someone to feel a certain way, think a certain way, act a certain way. So it's up to the individual if they take in that information. However, if it pleases you that, oh, I'm so glad, I can sleep tonight because I know that police are required 2 hours of implicit bias recognition every year. That's not a thing. We need systematic change. We need change within a larger, much bigger, much deeper rooted issue. But that's what we're going to get into next.
So as Olivia said, we're going to get into the two different main options right now as far as where do we go from here. So I'm going to cover reform and Olivia is going to cover abolishing the police. So first and foremost about reform, it's something that is still changing to this day as far as what needs to be required to reform the police. But as of right now, from a New York Times article called A Discussion About How to Reform Policing, moderated by Emily Bazelon, it talks about that, this may not be the best option or the best method, but it is an option on the table. And it talks about how there was a police executive research forum found that the agencies spent a median of 58 hours on training recruits on gun use, 49 hours of defensive tactics, and just 8 on de-escalation tactics. So again, that's a median, and it's kind of re-highlighting what Olivia just said. And another thing that needs to be taken into consideration with reform is that it would be continuous training or reform, and training for reform and accountability and consequences. And Olivia and I talked about this too. Continuous training is also, that's expensive. That's a lot of money. Yeah. And so from Vanita Gupta, who is the chief executive of the Leadership Conference on Human Rights, calls for a national police registry of police misconduct. So we stop cycling officers that are unfit for the job. And right now, the biggest thing that's going on in Congress in regards to Black Lives Matter is the Democrat bill that is going through Congress right now. So from the New York Times article, Democrats unveil sweeping bill targeting police misconduct and racial bias by Katie Edmondson. It talks about this new Democrat bill, and it says that this new bill is called Justice in Policing Act. And what it would do is it would erase protections against police officers being prosecuted and would require deadly force to be used as the last resort. So this would also make the requirement for what police officers can be prosecuted for less intentional. As of right now, it has to be proven that the police officers willfully did this, but with this new bill, it has to be proven with reckless disregard for the individual's rights. So essentially, a less difficult thing to prove.
Yeah.
And also, it would require all uniformed officers to wear body cams, which, as Olivia and I have discussed before, that's money in regards to body cams.
It's not even just like purchasing body cameras, but it's storing all of the footage. And yeah, I mean, that costs a lot of money, and it's a lot of storage. So.
Right. Yeah. This bill also would include some federal grants for anti-discriminatory training. It would limit the militarization of state and local police. It would ban no-knock warrants. And it is also hoping to push lynching to a federal crime, although a certain Senate Majority Leader, aka Mitch McConnell, wants to narrow the language down to avoid excessive sentencing, which that's a bit ironic. We already have that going on with Black and brown people. But and also, I just want to say, outright, the article also mentions this, that Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden, as of right now, do not stand for defunding the police as of July 2020.
Yeah, so I think something too that should be mentioned is, defunding the police and reform are not the same.
Right.
Because reforming costs a lot of money, as we've talked about. It's adding a lot of things to an already corrupt state, and it's just not, take it as you will and make your own decisions for what you think should happen.
Right.
But it doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think sometimes when people hear the phrase defund police, they're like, but don't you want to make it better? Like, how do you defund it if all these resources cost money? And so that's where abolition comes in. So I think that the current state of police is too corrupt. So I think because of the history, as we mentioned, built on racism, needs to be taken down entirely, because it cannot be truly and integrally changed without formal deconstruction, abolition. The sort of thing that was going around in response to the Black Lives Matter movement, and I saw a lot of famous people share it, was called 8 Can't Wait. And this was a little graphic that people were putting on their Instagram, and it's about immediate change to police departments. So this is about reform. And these are the things that they talk about. Okay, ban chokeholds and strangleholds, require de-escalation, require warning before shooting, requires exhaust, requires exhausting all alternatives before shooting, duty to intervene, ban shooting and moving vehicles, things like that. So these are kind of the 8 key things that they are like, yeah, these need to happen for police to be not racist. And I think that you could have all of these things. These things aren't too radical. You could have all of these things and you could still have issues. This doesn't really stop anything. So in response to that, there was another campaign called 8 to Abolition, which is in direct response to 8 Can't Wait, and it's 8 things that could, sort of like an outlining plan to, because for us, like, abolition is just like, what? Because our system is so foundationally rooted on police
having police
and having this law enforcement system that it's like no one that trusts police or has grown up trusting police can imagine
not having them.
However, I will say, just with a little personal anecdote, like, I grew up not being taught that police officers were bad or that they were going to be the people to come save you and things like that. And, in talking with our friend Jared that we had a conversation with today, oh, no, of course he wasn't taught that. He was taught to, do exactly as you're told and, sort of fear police officers. And fear is such a strong thing.
Right.
And it really, manipulates trust.
Yeah.
Completely. And so when you fear someone, you can't trust someone, and when your trust is taken down, it's really hard to rebuild that. And so I will say that people opposing police or people saying get rid of police isn't necessarily hard. It isn't necessarily hard for everyone to imagine.
Right.
It is hard for someone to imagine. Some people are like, I can't imagine. Who am I going to call?
Right.
When I'm in trouble. Well,
right.
Now you know exactly how Black and brown people feel.
Yeah.
When they're in trouble, they don't feel like they are protected by police.
Mm-hmm.
And I experienced that firsthand for the first time in my life when during protests.
Yeah.
And it wasn't even to the same degree, not even close, but I sort of had like a shift there, and I was like, oh, wow, yeah, when that trust is broken, and when you no longer, it really changes things. So that's sort of the mindset behind abolition. This is taken from the 8 to Abolition website that I was just talking about. They say, as abolitionists, we recognize that reforms that do not reduce the power of police, including those proposed by 8 Can't Wait, simply create new opportunities to surveil, police, and incarcerate Black, brown, indigenous, poor, disabled, trans, gender-oppressed, queer, migrant people, and those who work in street economies. We believe in a world where there are 0 police murders because there are 0 police, not because police are better trained or better regulated. Indeed, history has shown that ending police violence through more training or regulations is impossible.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to read a couple of the things that they say as far as, their steps to abolition. So first one is defunding the police. And this is something that we hear a lot. And this is also something that Patrisse Cullors, who is a part of Black Lives Matter, as you mentioned, she's one of the founders.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that she believes. So kind of tying it back to, Black Lives Matter as an organization, this is definitely an integral part of it. So sort of the idea behind that is, rejecting any proposed expansion to police budgets, demanding the highest budget cuts per year until they slash police budget to 0, require police, not cities, to be liable for misconduct and violence settlements, ban police contracting for non-profits and institutions, reduce the power of police unions, abolish asset forfeiture programs and laws, deplatform white supremacist public officials, which is like...
That's a basic one. Yeah, we should have had that one a long time ago.
But,
yeah.
Damn. So, prohibit private-public innovation schemes that profit from temporary technological fixes to systemic problems of police abuse and violence. These contracts and data sharing arrangements, however profitable for technologists and reformists, are lethal. Then number 2, demilitarize communities, which comes back to, riot gear, but not even just riot gear. I mean, just all police officers having guns and, tasers and things on them that really, like you said, produce fear and sort of wait for something to happen. It's like it's on you, so you just want to use it, or you just feel like you need to. Disarm law enforcement officers, including the police and private security. Remove cops from hospitals. End militarization of black and brown neighborhoods by ending broken windows policing. Precision policing, community policing, and all iterations of quality of life policing programs. Surveillance technologies are weapons in the hands of law enforcement. End police, military, and immigration enforcement contracts with any private companies that provide these services, and prohibit the experimental design and rollout of in-house systems. Dismantle fusion centers, county crime analysis centers, real-time crime centers, gun and gang violence intelligence centers, and purge the attendant databases. It goes on. I mean, you kind of get the point there. It's that communities are policed heavily, and that's why people think that black and brown people commit more crimes, because it's obviously going to be, if there are more police there, there are going to be more
arrests
and reports and proof and statistics, basically. 3, remove police from schools, which is an interesting one, I think. We had a police officer at our high school. Just one. Of course, it's not the same at every school, but 4, free people from prisons and jails. Permanently close local jails. This is an interesting one, because again, this is something that we think, no way. How could this ever happen? Permanently close local jails. Pressure state legislatures to end mandatory arrest and failure to protect laws that lead to the criminalization of survivors and gendered violence. Reject alternatives to incarceration that are carceral in nature, including problem-solving courts and electronic monitoring and coercive restorative justice programs. Reduce jail churns by reducing arrests. Cut funding to prosecutor offices and civil commitment. The list goes on again. I mean, take some time to read this because it's interesting. Definitely. For people that have never considered that ever happening.
And I think kind of what you said, you have to realize that it's steps. Because I know when I was first reading that, I was like, whoa, like I can't even imagine a world like that. But 5, repeal laws that criminalize survival. So, we can feel bad for Jean Valjean in Les Mis when he steals a loaf of bread to feed his family, but he's a white person, so we feel bad for him. But people commit crimes because they're trying to survive. People steal because there's a system that does not support them enough that they can live comfortably. 6, invest in community self-governance. 7, provide safe, accessible housing for everyone. And 8, fully invest in care, not cops. This is one that people, I feel like, have been talking about a little more. And that, like, allocating city funding towards healthcare infrastructure, like mental health care, wellness resources, trauma centers, non-coercive drug and alcohol treatment programming. Because, and make these services available for free to low-income residents. Adopt a care, not cops model. Because, and I'm reading that from the website, but because, again, as we mentioned, cops instill fear. And, you think about it, like, okay, cops have to do mental health
work, and they have to, or if they do, you know, like here in Missouri, you know, there are suicide rates for cops, things like that. And I'm not trying to sympathize. However, they have a lot of different jobs for one job.
Yeah.
Why do we call police when people are considering suicide?
Yeah.
Why?
Right. What is a
police officer going to do besides, I guess, hand you to the next person that might help you?
Right.
But it's like, I don't know. It's just, they are our first, you know, go-to.
Right.
And I think, again, as I said before, you know, taking away your mentality. I mean, just shifting your perspective on this, because a lot of people do not have the opportunity or the privilege to shift their perspective. Their perspective has been this way their entire life, which is, you know, I have to fear these people because they do not want to protect me.
Yeah.
And I think for white people, or for people that do not fear police, that it's important to understand why people do, and understand that your trust and your protection are a privilege.
Yeah.
And understand that if the system isn't fit for everyone, then why is it a system that is being overfunded?
Yeah.
Why is it a system that is, you know, foundational to our law enforcement?
Yeah.
Why?
And everyone is supposed to obey the police and respect the police. Yeah, I think that's totally valid. And you know, I definitely, reading the Abolition to 8 to Abolition, sorry. Mm-hmm. I said Abolition to 8. You know, having had a member of my community suffer from gun violence, you know, I read a lot of the things that they were talking about in regards to taking away, I think it was metal detectors in places. And, you know, when I was reading it, I was like, okay, well, isn't that contradicting, you know, the gun violence movement? And, you know, but then when you look at it, like I said, as steps, and you realize that, you know, this is based off of a society that...
A system that's broken.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, you know, when we finally start fixing things little by little, we will eventually get to a society where we don't need that, because we have mental health professionals who are taking care of people, you know, and it's not just all forced on one particular branch, and, you know, they're expected to do everything, because nobody can do everything. That it takes a team.
Right.
You know?
Right. And you could say that, you know, there's no one fix, and it's never going to be perfect.
Right.
Why not try?
Yeah.
Or, you know, don't we owe that to every person, to at least that they can trust, or, you know, they don't have to fear for their lives, based on something so outdated to us.
Yeah.
You know, racism to us, to white people, is quote unquote outdated, because they think that, the things that have been put in place before, you know, it's outdated. That's already happened. It's over.
Right.
Especially because we don't see it. We don't feel it, you know.
Yeah.
And if someone is telling you, if someone is sharing with you their pain, if someone is sharing with you their experience and their fear and their hurt, listen to them.
Yeah.
Don't tell them they're wrong.
Right.
Especially if you're white. You simply cannot understand.
Right.
And that's okay. You know, you don't have to be right all the time. You can sit down and you can be quiet.
Right.
And you can let other people
speak
for themselves.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to this issue. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it is not my place to tell a black or brown person how to feel about the police.
Yeah.
And that they are wrong. Because I cannot imagine the hurt and the pain just so integrated within, so integral in them, so normal.
Yeah.
That's not okay.
Right.
So I encourage everyone to look at different perspectives, look at different ways that, what's going on and how are people trying to fix it. And, Black Lives Matter, the movement, the hashtag, all of that is important right now, but it's also about listening and growing and understanding and getting outside of your bubble and your comfort zone a little bit.
Yes. Period.
And next we have our interview with our suburban friend who grew up with us. This is Jared Newell. He's 21. He's queer, biracial. He's wonderful. He's definitely one of our good friends and has so many wonderful perspectives about intersectionality. We get to talk about his experiences and his opinions, and please have a listen. Sweet.
All right, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. This is Jared. He is a close friend of Olivia and I's, and he is a senior at K-State University, and we are very excited to have him here on the show. So, Jared, our first question is just to tell us a little bit about who you are, some things about you, and, what you love and what you're about.
Yeah, nice. So like Anahi said, my name is Jared. I attend Kansas State University. I'm studying biology. I'm going to be a senior this upcoming year. And then I have minors in both journalism and leadership studies, which is really interesting because not a lot of universities offer that. So that's been a great experience. I grew up with you guys, obviously, in Missouri. That's where I'm from. And I feel like I've had a lot of unique experiences, especially growing up in the Midwestern Missouri suburbs as a biracial queer kid, growing up and kind of discovering aspects of my identity as I got older, and just kind of how that was all shaped by living in a predominantly white area, a predominantly, straight area, and a relatively quiet area on issues of discrimination and racism, especially. So yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yay. Okay. So first we wanted to talk about just growing up, as you said, as a biracial person. What kind of things were you taught, as far as police, as far as any stories you have, any special anecdotes you want to share in regards to that?
Yeah, for sure. So I think a lot of people of color, especially Black people, can relate to when you're growing up, just especially learning like with the whole driving situation, because that's obviously a lot of the time you'll interact with police as being pulled over or something of that nature. So just your parents having to sit down with you and have the conversation of like, make sure you're doing this, make sure you're not doing this. If you're pulled over, have your hands on the wheel, make sure you know exactly where your license is, where your registration is, never drive with the tail light out, never drive without your license. Even things like being very weary of the rules, because I know especially when you like first get your license, you're only supposed to have a certain amount of people in the car. So like my parents didn't really even want me when I first got my license at 16 to have more than that. And I feel like that's a rule that not a lot of people actually follow, but they were just worried in breaking any of the rules because they obviously have seen the way that police treat Black people, and especially young Black men and things of that nature. So I feel like that was a lot of what the conversation surrounding police was, especially when things like Ferguson were happening, and just kind of seeing this awakening in the country of realizing how big of an issue police brutality is, and having it kind of get picked up by mainstream media.
Right. And also, like, when you said that about like your parents wanting you to follow all of those rules, honestly, I feel like it was either you or someone, but I felt like I was always so confused when certain kids would be like, "No, my parents aren't letting me do that." I'm like, "Well, then it doesn't matter. Like, you don't have to." Like my parents, I don't think would have cared. Like, I'm pretty sure I didn't follow that
Yeah.
as a white woman. Like, I don't think. Well, I know it was never on my radar to um, have worried about rules like that because I did not fear for my life if I had been pulled over. And, all these rules you talk about, like your hands on the wheel, things like that, like I literally was never taught that. I have never, I was never taught to fear police. I was taught to trust them and that if you were ever in danger, they would be the person you would call and they would
Yeah,
help you.
exactly.
And so that's just, I mean, even that, like you cannot deny that difference of how we were brought up and we were brought up in the same town,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
No, for sure. And that's especially, it's kind of weird, especially being biracial specifically. My mother is white. And so having to learn a lot of these things firsthand from like my dad's experiences being a black man, but then also just I was fortunate enough and still am very fortunate to have a mother who is white, but who is very informed on the issues and is an ally and understands the realities that black people face in this country. But that's not a luxury that necessarily every biracial kid gets. I feel like especially in our culture now, a lot of white women can tend to fetishize black men or fetishize the idea of having, a pretty mixed kid with like tan skin and like, curly hair or whatnot without realizing the realities of raising a black child. And I think that's a very real issue that I see people talk about. And I have friends who are mixed who are kind of in that situation.
Yeah.
And I do recognize that there's a certain amount of privilege that I don't have to deal with that from my own mother and that she keeps herself informed.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's sort of pulling away from the like general grand scheme of things and more about you as a person, as Jared. Um, Having known you since seventh grade, I know that you after
God, we're old.
yeah, after eighth grade, you moved to England. So you grew up in Missouri, grew up in Kansas City metro area, and then moved to England, and then now you're at K State. So kind of talk us through like your experiences with living in different places, and that perspective that you've been able to broaden.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I feel like people can have a tendency to kind of romanticize what Europe is like, especially England. I mean, British culture, while different than American culture, is very similar in a lot of ways. So I think it's easy to romanticize because, they speak English, their music style is similar but different enough for us to kind of latch onto it and a lot of people to get very infatuated with it.
Right.
But racism is a really big reality in England and in the UK in a lot of ways, and in, I mean, the whole world. But I feel like a lot of people tend to latch racism onto what America is, as opposed to racism is deeply embedded in human culture. It goes across languages, it goes across, country lines and things of that nature. And that's a very big reality that I faced when I moved to England. And the racism there was definitely different. I mean, at its core, it's the same hatred, but it was different in terms of it was very covert. So it was a lot of people, it was a lot of othering. So one being biracial and then also American. You can imagine going to a predominantly white school of all British people. It's very easy to other me. And on top of all of that, being rather feminine and people perceiving that as gay, which like I wasn't out at the time, obviously, but I mean, they were right. So good for them, I guess. But it was very interesting because it was easy to be othered. And I honestly had a good experience in England overall, the way I remember. I mean, I made very close friends. I enjoyed being there. I enjoyed exploring Europe and things of that nature. And that's definitely a big privilege that a lot of people don't have. And I recognize that. And I really I'm grateful for my experience, but it's also just the fact of being like, I honestly could count on one, maybe two hands at my whole school, which was like year 8 through, it was year 7 or 8 through like year 13. So like that many grades. I could probably count on one or two hands the amount of Black or brown students at my school.
Yeah.
There really weren't many. I mean, there were people of color, not very much. I mean, there were other Black students, there were Asian students, you know, but it really was a situation where it just didn't feel like our voices were heard or amplified. Also, people just weren't as educated. So specific instances I can remember, it's just like everyone wanting to touch my hair and very much that thing, which is something a lot of people here talk about, and is a very true reality here as well. But moving to England, it was like, oh my goodness, his hair, and like all this, just because there weren't that many other Black or brown students in the entire school. And so I definitely think it was an interesting crash course in the ways that racism can manifest from a social perspective, not necessarily as, you know, overt as like the KKK or something of that nature, but seeing how it can kind of like permeate through school. And then also just things like English teachers being surprised when I was a good writer, you know, when I had good answers in class, things of that nature. It's a very interesting experience, kind of being exoticized in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Do you have any specific stories about when you moved to K-State or living in Manhattan, Kansas, or even with the university itself?
Yes. Oh, do I ever? So a lot of people may know this, some may not, but Kansas State University has been in the news a lot recently. I mean, even just within the last 5-ish or so years, with racist incidents on campus, in the Manhattan community at large. A crash course, some examples. My freshman year, there were white nationalist posters hung up all over the quad that had been put out during the night. And I work in research, so I was going to my lab early that morning, and I was up at like 7, walking from my dorm. And like as a freshman, how terrifying it is to see that. Like I'm pretty sure it was my first semester in college at all. So
Yeah.
seeing that was definitely terrifying, and just feeling very like isolated, and then feeling like maybe administration's response to it wasn't as swift as it should have been. And then also things like before I was even at the university, there was like a noose found in a tree and things of that nature. So K-State has a lineage of racist incidents and small-minded people and very racist people. Even things like once a girl did like, she made racist remarks with like a black face mask on or something, and it was a student at Kansas State University. There's been a lot of instances like that in particular. So I definitely just feel like the culture at our university and in this area needs some change. And then on top of all of that, more recently, we have, I don't even know how to describe this individual. I guess he's essentially like a famous, in terms of internet popularity, like a famous white nationalist kind of person, very America at the forefront of things, very, you know, homophobic things, transphobic things, racist things, who is a student at the university and has a large online following. And he often sends his followers to harass students at K-State. I know I have a friend who plays on the women's basketball team. She spoke up about some comments he had made that a lot of people have been speaking up about, specifically regarding Mr. Floyd and that whole incident. And there were some very insensitive things. And of course, he wanted to pass it off as a joke. But people were rightfully so outraged, as was I. And I have a friend on the women's basketball team who spoke up about that, basically saying until action is taken by the university, she and other athletes won't play. They won't, you know, bring in the university revenue. you know, people on the football team, people on the basketball team taking a stand against this. And then, like, the following day, one of his followers or supporters sent a DM that had her face edited on to a person being hung by a tree with a noose. Yeah. So definitely just the culture of Manhattan in general and Kansas State is an interesting one. For sure. And there's a long history of injustices. But I mean, on the flip side of that, there are also a lot of really great advocates, mostly students, sadly. I personally don't think students should have to fight for their right to exist while also trying to juggle everything that majority students have to juggle. But it's a sad reality, especially for a lot of people who go to maybe conservative leaning or smaller town still kind of universities. Because while K-State is definitely not in a small town, I mean, we have over 20,000 students. A lot of the students do come from small towns and are uneducated on some of the issues of discrimination and stuff in the country.
And would you say, like, a lot of the student body is made up of people that come from the suburbs or just not, like, major city areas, or would it be more, like, rural?
The interesting thing about K-State is it's definitely a mix. I mean, there are a lot of people who come from, like, the JoCo area, you know, the KC Metro area, as well as a lot of students who come for the agriculture programs, who come from more rural communities. And not to, like, generalize people from, you know, the suburbs or from rural communities, but I feel like a lot of them, I mean, will even admit it, that they perhaps had never had a Black friend or, you know, met a queer person before coming to K-State.
Right.
And there's nothing, it's not like it's that individual's fault, but obviously then they aren't educated on the issues. So then when you multiply that times however many students have similar experiences, it's kind of a breeding ground for ignorance of a lot of different varieties.
Well, and, like, what decisions, what deciding factors went into you going to K-State? Like, what were the reasons you wanted to go?
Yeah, so mainly one, scholarships they were offering me. I mean, all three of us are college students. We know how expensive college is.
Right.
And then also just the fact of being in a science field and wanting to be involved in research. K-State is a research institution, so I've had a lot of wonderful opportunities in that sense to be able to have my research funded or have my job be working in a research lab and getting that experience. I've done that since freshman year. So I definitely say those opportunities are really what drew me to K-State.
So I feel like people could, you know, people might say, oh, well, you know, maybe he shouldn't have gone to an ag school if he didn't want to experience this. Well, people are able to go wherever they want and not have to deal with the racism and the, you know, all of these issues that you describe. You know, it shouldn't just be like special to one school. And I commend, you know, your peers and you for standing up, you know, and saying that this is wrong and action needs to be taken, because you shouldn't, you know, have to pick a school with a different, you know, you went for the research, right? Like you deserve to go to a school that has a good research program and something that fits you, and not be
exactly. And that's the kind of sad thing. I mean, even just when considering it, my mom was very much like, you know, it's kind of more of an ag school. It's not like everyone who comes here is from an agriculture background, but it did start off as like a land grant university, and our ag program is one of our bigger ones. I mean, we also do have, you know, theater programs, we have a great engineering programs and things like that. But I definitely agree with you that it's sad that this would factor in, but it also is a harsh reality. I mean, enrollment from Black students to Kansas State University is dropping, and will, I mean, likely continue to drop due to these inactions on the part of administration, but also just the general vibe on campus and in the community. And the sad thing is, it's not, I mean, this situation is specific to Kansas State, but this happens at a lot of universities in the Midwest, you know, which is unfair because students of color shouldn't have to, unless they want to, be pushed to, you know, coastal schools in liberal areas just because they fear for their safety, especially when, like I said, education costs how much. Like, people should be able to attend public state institutions without being worried for their safety.
Yeah.
Right.
Sorry, I have a question. You talked about in England, not smaller, but instances of racism that maybe were not quite as public as, what you had mentioned had happened at K-State. And,
Yeah.
you said going to schools on the coast, and going to a school on the coast that is conservative. I would like to say that, that still happens, but it definitely happens in less public manners as far as acts of racism. And, I can remember, from where we grew up, people telling me that they weren't allowed to date Black boys. And so I want to ask you about certain, maybe you can give some instances or some examples of, those private acts of racism, where it wasn't said in front of a ton of people, and, giving examples. So that way, hopefully when people listen, they will say, oh, so, what I heard, what was said in conversation, that was wrong. And that's something that I need to be addressing. If you have any.
Yeah. No, for sure. I mean, I think especially these like smaller microaggressions can kind of get swept under the rug because perhaps they're harder to address. I mean, when someone says something that is blatantly racist, there's no denying it. Like, I don't know, calling you a slur, or, saying something very demeaning of a whole race of people. It's easier in a sense to call it out because it's undeniable. Whereas, like you said, growing up in the suburbs, especially in smaller instances, it's harder to call out the microaggressions because you're like, oh, am I like overreacting?
Yeah.
Is it unfair of me to feel this way? But some specific ones I can remember. And the sad thing is, I think also, in a sense, microaggressions are less called out because people don't want to admit, but like a lot of the time it is white liberals,
Yeah.
Doing these microaggressions. And I think any advocacy work, especially going on right now with Black Lives Matter and stuff, is very commendable. But I think the hardest form of advocacy is the type in yourself of dismantling your own biases, dismantling your own prejudices, and doing the work on yourself. It's easy to call out, very obviously like white nationalists and being like, that's racist, this is evil, we need to fix this. But it's harder to look inward and be like, oh, maybe my track record of behavior would lead some people to believe I have biases, which, a lot of people do. But some specific ones I can remember, two in specific that were said by white liberals who I was friends with in high school. And I think both of these people, I mean, it's important to acknowledge people can change and whatnot. And this isn't, I mean, I'm not going to say names, but this isn't like a call out post or whatever. And people can definitely change, but I think it's hard to realize how much your words can stick with someone. But I remember one specific instance at a lunch table in high school. We were talking about something. It was around the 2016 election. I don't remember exactly what we were talking about, but it had to do with race. And I referred to myself as Black because, being a biracial person, you are still a Black person. And it's not saying you're biracial. I mean, you could be any races. I mean, in this country, we assume it means you're Black and you're white, but, So I referred to myself as Black, and someone stopped me. And she was like, you're not Black. And then she caught herself in a sense, and she was like, well, you're not like white either. And then she was like, you're just like you, kind of. And that's something, I know, take a minute. It is kind of laughable in a sense because it's dumb. I mean, it is dumb, especially to call out me speaking my experiences or identifying myself. And they're like, you're not this, you're not that, you're just you. Like, that's so minimizing in a lot of ways.
Right.
I'm sure this person has grown from, saying ignorant stuff. But it is true that that sticks with you. And if I brought it up to that person, they may not even remember that specific instance. You know what I mean? Another one I can think of, especially being biracial, one time my friend referred to the house I grew up in as a white household. And this was a white woman saying this. And it interesting. I think eventually, if I'm remembering right, we had a conversation about it and she apologized. Um, and like I said, you can change and you can grow, but those kind of comments just stick with you, especially when it's someone deleting a part of your experience, which I feel like is especially true when you are biracial. Because I mean, there is a certain amount of privileges that come with being biracial, you know, when we're talking about like colorism and not being as dark as like people who are like fully black or darker skinned. But there also is, I mean, anywhere you fall, there's a certain microaggressions, you know, like darker skinned girls being told they're pretty for a dark girl, you know, whatever that's supposed to mean. But it's very interesting that when you're mixed, it's almost like white people who aren't educated have this innate need to minimize your experiences, which is very interesting. And that's definitely something that I experienced a lot during high school and growing up in the suburbs, is people who consider themselves quote unquote woke, saying ignorant things, you know, shoving their foot in their mouth, and then realizing eventually that what they said was not okay. But it's almost interesting because you're like, I'm kind of glad you said it, because you have this internal bias that has obviously been harboring inside of you, and you flipped up and you said something. So like, hopefully you can learn from this moment. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think that something that's interesting about what you said too is like, because you mentioned white liberals, like people kind of, I think, or as a white person, people, and I can fall into this, you know, mindset as well. Like I consider myself a part of, I don't consider myself liberal or conservative, but, you know, progressive. I think, oh, you know, I'm excused from that because, you know, I'm in a group that identifies with this and that, and everyone on this side is this, but everyone on this side isn't. And that's, I mean, that just can't be true, because for one, something that you know, Dawson says often, my boyfriend or other people have said, is like, a lot of white people think that they are one of the few non-racist white people that exist. Like they kind of just have this like special, like, I guess special snowflake syndrome or whatever. It's, you know,
for sure.
Where you think, oh well, you know, because you know your intentions and you know your what, you know, whatever, that you, I guess, aren't, you know, you're one of the very few people out there, and you know, you can see other people's racism, but you can't see it within yourself. And
exactly,
we think that it is very important that you bring up, you know, even liberals, anyone can say something, and it's like, sure, you're not going to be perfect, but you can also just kind of shut your mouth sometimes, and, you know, or learn from it or understand your implicit bias and your implicit of the world.
And I think that's something a lot of people can fall into, is thinking, well, if I'm this, there's no way I can be whatever. So like, you know, thinking if I'm a POC, there's no way I can be anti-black. But in a lot of ways, for other groups of color, they used anti-blackness as a way to assimilate into white culture because it was a relatability factor. And a lot of people are realizing that, you know, my friends who are Asian American or Latinx are realizing that in themselves and their culture, that perhaps their parents did bring them up with beliefs about Black people or dark people that are unfair. And I think it's hard, of course, to unpack that, but I think you have to, if you want to be a true advocate and do progressive work or advocacy work, it's important to unpack it within yourselves. I also see, you know, a lot of gay men thinking that there's no way they can be sexist because, you know, there's this belief system that, you know, only heterosexual men can be sexist, or, you know, gay people thinking they can't be transphobic, which of course that's not true. In a lot of ways, it's those microaggressions or those blocking off of spaces or, you know, silencing other people's voices that kind of shows where your implicit biases lie.
Right. Yeah. For sure. Okay, so I think our last question does kind of tie into that, which is about intersectionality, because you are queer. So I wanted to talk about some similarities maybe within Black Lives Matter movement or within these movements in general, protests, and how they um, relate to, you know, the gay community and Stonewall uprisings and things like that.
Yeah, for sure. So in a lot of ways, I know probably a lot of people maybe who use social media a lot have probably seen it by now, but this Pride Month was kind of, you know, a thing going around is like the first Pride was a protest, you know, and in that people are meaning there's no better way to quote unquote celebrate Pride than fighting for people's rights.
Yeah.
And fighting for civil liberties and things of that nature. And I think that's a really, you know, catchy tagline to go around is, you know, the first Pride was a protest, and that's an easy way to box it in. And I think it does a good job of summing it up, but I think it's also important to like unpack that. So in the sense that, you know, the first Pride at Stonewall had to do with police brutality. Mm-hmm. It was led by a lot of trans people, mm-hmm. a lot of lesbians, a ton of people of color, you know, Black trans women, Marsha P. Johnson, Latinx trans people. And I think it's important to realize that a lot of the rights that queer people today, especially young queer people, myself included, we can take for granted, you know? There's still a lot of homophobia that goes around in the world. But I mean, we have to admit it's not as bad as it was before things like Stonewall or before our queer elders started, you know, taking the streets to march for our rights. I also think it's important to identify that all the things that I take for granted would not be possible without Black people. Yeah. Black queer activists were at the forefront of every queer movement. They were the ones who couldn't hide. They were the ones who were, you know, refusing to be pushed back into the shadows where they had been pushed into their whole life. They're the ones who fought back against the police at Stonewall. And I think it's important to look back at that and identify that, because especially with the way media is today, I feel like it's a lot of amplifying of gay voices and queer voices that fit into a good, pretty box to look at. So, you know, like the white, gay, cis male, you know, that's a voice. When people want queer representation, what do? They put a white gay person in it, which is great in the sense, yes, it's representation, but we can't keep being pleased by this representation that's become consumable for the media. You know, we have to push for better representation of queer people, of trans people, of lesbians. I think that's another big issue is the voices of people who identify as women can get stifled, you know, lesbians' voices, trans women's voices, just because the media has made it more consumable to listen to cis gay male voices, especially white ones. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's very important that we recognize where queer rights came from. And also, like, talking about intersectionality, none of these issues are independent of each other, because they can't be, you know. Black liberation and Black Lives Matter can't be removed from talks about sexism, because, you know, Black women exist. They can't be removed from talks about homophobia, because Black queer people exist. Black trans people exist. They can't be removed from talks about ableism, because Black disabled people exist. Right. And so I think it's easy to want to simplify the Black Lives Matter movement to a certain thing and make it seem, while it is obviously a hard fight, I think it's easy to want to simplify it, because our brains like simple solutions, simple answers. Yeah. But it's not a simple solution. I mean, the racism exists in education. It obviously exists in the prison system. It exists in the workplace, anywhere. I mean, it exists in any industry, even ones that you would paint as liberal industries, like the film industry and things of that nature. And so I definitely think it's important to never remove talks of intersectionality when we're talking about Black Lives Matter, especially when we're thinking about where we come from. You know, some of the best civil rights leaders and some of the best Black advocates were women or disabled people or queer people. And so I think it's very important to never shy away from talking about racism and sexism, because a lot of people experience both and they hold the community down in different ways, but they work together, you know?
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, thank you so much, Jared, for talking to us. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your input and your stories.
Thank you so much. It was really fun talking to you guys. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
All right, so next we have questions from a NAACP lawyer, which NAACP stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And from their website, a little bit of history about them is that they were founded in 1909 in response to the ongoing violence against Black people around the country. Their vision is to ensure a society in which all individuals have equal rights without discrimination based on race. And their objectives include ensuring the political, educational, social, and economic equality of all citizens, achieving equality of rights and eliminating race prejudice among the citizens of the United States, removing all barriers of racial discrimination through democratic processes, seeking enactment and enforcement of federal, state, and local laws securing civil rights, informing the public of the adverse effects of racial discrimination and to seek its elimination, and educating persons as to their constitutional rights, and to take all lawful action to secure the exercise thereof, and to take any other lawful action in furtherance of these objectives, consistent with the NAACP's Articles of Incorporation in this Constitution. So like I said, I had the pleasure of interviewing the NAACP Missouri Chapter President, Mr. Nimrod Chappell Jr. From his NAACP website biography, it says that he's an experienced trial attorney who has tackled a wide range of legal issues in Missouri. He received a Bachelor of Science in Economics from Oklahoma State University, his law degree from Tulane University, and his master's in tax from Washington University in St. Louis. He is an active member of the Missouri Bar, and an important quote from his website is Chappell Jr. All right, thank you so much, guys, for tuning in this week. We have our interview with Mr. Rod Chappell. He is the president of the Missouri State Conference for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and he has agreed to interview with us this week for his expert opinion on some of the questions that you have. And just one really important quote before we get started with the interview that I took from the website that I think is excellent is Nimrod is committed to moving equality forward for every Missouri family. I think that's a great way to start. So, Mr. Chappell, first and foremost, thank you so much for agreeing to be on the show. But my first question is, can you tell us a little bit about you, where you're from, and how you became so successful?
Oh, sure. Well, thanks for having me. I have to tell you that I appreciate the opportunity not only to speak with you today, but to talk about these important issues.
Thank you.
I am a trial lawyer right now and work in my volunteer capacity with the NAACP in the state of Missouri. We don't have any paid employees to speak of here. Some other places do, but that's just not a thing that we have. But I tell you what, I have a passion for civil rights, equality, and justice that has grown in me from a very young age. I was born in Oklahoma. My mother's an educator. My father was a contractor. Worked for a long time, both in higher ed and privately. And to be very candid, it started with something that was close to me. I witnessed my father having a very bad day after having completed some work, a project, and the contractor decided they weren't going to pay him.
Oh, wow.
So I asked him, I said, what's going on? And he says, well, it's either because I'm a small contractor and they think they can just not pay me, and that happens sometimes,
Wow.
or it's because I'm black and they don't want to pay me. And so we talked about that for a while and how unfair that was. Even as a 7-year-old, I can remember where I was standing in the yard having a conversation. I knew then that, it's not all the money in the world, but it was going to have an impact on us.
Yeah.
So I asked what he was going to do about it. He says, well, I'm going to sue him. And we talked about that. And that's when I decided I was going to be a lawyer, because I understood that through the courts of law, that we could seek justice and have a better opportunity to get the things that we're entitled to, or at least fair treatment. And I knew then that I needed to be a lawyer and perhaps one day even a judge.
All right. Wow. What an amazing story. Thank you for sharing that. So my next question is kind of more into the issues that we are currently facing. So if you are a Black or Indigenous person of color, what are your rights if you are stopped? I feel like a lot of people really don't know, how to approach these situations. So in your best opinion, what are your rights?
Sure. Well, if you're driving in Missouri, you have an excellent opportunity to get stopped if you're a person of color, in particular if you're black, almost 100%, and sometimes way above that, depending on the particular jurisdiction.
Wow.
So you have to show all the legal requirements or all the legal documentation, which would be, license, insurance, registration, that kind of thing. Now, what you do not have to do is agree to a search, and you should not ever agree to a search.
Okay.
Either they've got a lawful reason to search and they're going to do it anyway, or they don't. And sometimes it can be very awkward. I mean, imagine someone asking you, "Can I have a glass of water?" This is something that the officer feels like he or she needs, but in reality, their needs are in total conflict most of the time with your rights as a citizen. So, if they're going to search, they're going to do it anyway, but never agree to that.
Okay. Thank you. So the next question is about a past case. So in the Trayvon Martin case, George Zimmerman was protected by the Stand Your Ground law. Can you describe a little bit about the Stand Your Ground law, and do we have that in Missouri? And then what can you do in that situation if someone is quote unquote standing their ground against you?
Sure. Now, this is a very dangerous situation, and I'll tell you why. A few years ago, I had an individual who was more or less stalking me, popping up, random threats of violence, that kind of thing. Contacted the police, let them know what was going on, totally appropriate. And I'll tell you that you never want to be in a situation where you've got to defend yourself. But many times, we as citizens will not have the luxury, won't have the ability to wait until law enforcement arrives. And so you've got to make some decisions.
Right.
The Stand Your Ground law, as it was with Zimmerman, essentially says that you don't have a duty to retreat. That if someone is attacking you or bringing a fight to you, it's another way to say it, that you don't have to leave. Missouri has the Castle Doctrine, which is very similar, but it says that it's not everywhere, right? So if you're in Walmart, it's different than if you're at home. So if you're at home or at your car, some people would argue, in Missouri, then you've got a right to defend yourself. And you can use deadly force, and that has happened. One time you may have seen a case that happened down, I can't remember the name of the river here in Missouri, but some people were rafting down a river. They get off one of them gets off on a bank, and I don't know what they were doing there, but the guy comes out and shoots them.
Oh, wow.
My goodness, that's terrible.
Yeah.
Right? Here's how it shakes out, though. If the Castle Doctrine is used and the person, whoever dies, right, in general, unless there's really, really good evidence that would remove them from the constricture of the Castle Doctrine, then the person who is left alive is going to win. I mean, that's really how it shakes out.
Wow.
Yeah. So if there are two people left, if both people there and they get to tell their story, then maybe you get a fair adjudication of the events. But if just one person is there, and of course there's not often going to be video or anything. Right. So it's, that's how that works.
And the family is left to deal with the injustice.
Oh, sure.
Wow.
Yeah, with many, many questions about why and how this happened. And, yeah.
Wow.
It's not good.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that answer. My next question is, in regards to laws, it looks like the Stand Your Ground law is something that is, from what I understand, is here to stay. But are there any laws that we should be looking at to advance equality in Missouri?
Oh, sure. Well, I think I would start with repealing some laws.
Okay.
Senate Bill 43 passed in 2017 legalized discrimination in the state of Missouri.
Wow.
It says that individuals can discriminate, harass, and retaliate against other people, and that they cannot be sued in court. Now, so if that happens at work, and you say you work at a restaurant, you could sue the restaurant, but you couldn't sue the supervisor or the individual that did it. That's not right.
Yeah.
So I would say that we need to change that. It also put caps on the amount of damages based on the size of the business. Now, some businesses may be small, like, say, less than 50 people, but do an incredible amount of damage to another person. I mean, because this would include a racially motivated physical attack. It could include years of harassment. It could include back pay, because that's their person of of color or female didn't receive the correct amount of pay.
Yeah.
So it's not a good remedy. So I would say start there. The one thing that we really have to do is also be on guard for our right to vote. It's under attack in Missouri. In 2016, Missourians took one provision out of the Constitution, which was ridiculous. But now we have an Attorney General named Jay Ashcroft. I'm sorry, he is the Secretary of State in Missouri, and dead set on restricting minority representation at the ballot. The legislature is doing the same thing. So the NAACP has sued Jay Ashcroft twice. The first time saying that he was lying about photo ID. He was literally putting out wrong information that people had to rely on to go vote. So it created mass confusion.
Yeah.
2 lawsuits were filed on that issue. The same result happened. They told him you can't do that. And then he has tried to restrict the ability of people to use absentee ballots, requiring a notary for that. And in the pandemic, we feel like that's unnecessary and ridiculous.
Yeah.
So that's still pending here in Cole County. Now, there's another issue in Clean, Missouri. You may remember, Clean was going to take the money out of politics, provide information on redistricting. I say information, prevent gerrymandering during redistricting. The Missouri legislature has introduced a proposal that would literally take us back to Dred Scott. You may recall Dred Scott was a court decision decided here in Missouri by the Missouri Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And they decided that there were no rights that a black person had that had to be respected by a white person.
Right.
Ridiculous decision, you know.
Yeah.
Well, bring that forward to today. The legislature literally proposes not counting children. Now, the aim of not counting children for the purposes of redistricting only, unlike the census where you count everybody, or unlike taxes where everybody gets counted, the aim of this is to eliminate a minority, a segment of the minority population, to diminish the capacity of those groups to be able to vote and have representative government and state government. The statistics show that if you eliminate the counting children totally, the number of Caucasian children that will not be counted is way lower than the number of Black and Hispanic children that will not be counted. So for communities that are already underrepresented in the legislature, you would be ensuring that they would not be able to catch up. And so those are some things that we need to watch out for right now. Senate Bill 600 is sitting on the governor's desk. I would suggest that, you know, fair-minded people call the governor at 573-751-3222 and ask him to veto that bill. It over-criminalizes and brings back some of the harshest punishments like mandatory minimums and will expand the jails by at least 800 to 1,000 people.
Oh, wow.
Missouri would have to Missouri would have to create or build additional jails and staff those. Cost of that's $500 million.
Right.
Now here's the thing: the legislature passed that while they came back to deal with pandemic issues. So why would anybody be trying to build more prisons to over-criminalize conduct that's already against the law?
Right.
And do so where the people can't see it, and that's exactly what happened.
Wow. Okay, so just to repeat that, you said that was Senate Bill number 600, correct?
Yes, that's exactly right.
All right, and call Governor Parsons at 573-751-3222, correct?
Correct, that's right.
Perfect.
That's right.
And that kind of leads me into another question that a lot of suburban kids had, which was just, you know, I don't have a lot of money right now because, you know, I'm in college or I'm about to go to college, and the cost of education is super expensive, and trying, especially now that, you know, a lot of places are only at half capacity due to COVID, it's very hard to find a job. So as far as donating, you know, they feel like they can't really donate, and they've been to protests and they've been signing petitions. But a lot of kids just have the question of, what more can I do? And I think you just, you know, really highlighted one, which was calling the governor, our governor. But, you know, what else would you recommend that people do to keep this Black Lives Matter movement going and to fight for justice?
Absolutely, and that's an excellent question. There's so much. So, and I understand resources are short, you know, but if folks have time and are willing, there are people who are running for office. So that would be one way to help. Now, I wouldn't even presume to tell people how to vote. And you can't necessarily look at a particular party, Democrat or Republican, and say that all their policies are going to be great.
Right.
But you can sure look at some candidates and see where they are on the policy issues and say, hey, I like that person. So if people like the way things are going, working on any incumbent from, rural Missouri's campaign would be something they could do. But if you don't like what's happening in Missouri today, if you don't think that things are right, things aren't fair, then a good way to have your voice would be engage in phone banking. You can do that from home. They'll give you an app. It brings up people. You tell them about a particular issue or candidate, and that's a great opportunity. Now, that also works with issues, too, because Amendment 2 is going to be on the ballot November 3rd.
Okay.
That expands Medicaid. The expansion of Medicaid, you may have heard of the Medicaid 23. I had the pleasure of representing those 23 pastors from around the state, from around the state, who came and prayed and sang Bible songs, or religious songs, and did some chanting of Bible hymns in the Senate gallery. Well, they were prosecuted here in Cole County in Jefferson City for what we're talking about will be on the ballot. This is the number one thing that we can do as a health initiative in the state to ensure that Black and brown people get off the leading edge of COVID-19 in terms of dying.
Okay.
Yeah. So working with that campaign, Medicare expansion, if anybody were to just Google it, will come right up. And I know that they're doing phone banking. Because of the pandemic, people can't get out. But here's the other thing. They're also more stationary. So you can reach somebody with a text or with a phone call. And so that's an excellent opportunity. Likewise, there is not a chance, but there is time where some of the programs that we're looking at that are at work in our local communities need additional assistance. So if, for example, and you can do this as a member of the NAACP or not, but you can certainly contact an organization like that or another one in your community and suggest to them that the numbers for racial profiling, and there's only, a handful of cities in the state that have good numbers, and most of those are ancillary law enforcement providers like a sheriff's department who doesn't have, bad statistics on racial profiling. But to bring pressure to the mayor, ask the mayor, what are you doing to ensure that all people have the right to use the road fairly? And they'll say, well, I believe that because we all do.
Right.
But it turns out that if you're Black, you don't have equal use of the law, equal application of the law, and it's a violation of due process in the way that it's being executed. So the mayor is the only person, most of the time in city council, that have the ability to check, if you will, the police chief, because the police chiefs aren't elected. And they'll give you all kinds of excuses about, we're working on it. We think this is going to be better. We have to do it this way because of this and that. But the reality is that when you tie the chief of police's compensation or ability to stay in that position or performance evaluation to how are people being policed? Are you over-policing people because they're Black? And how do we know? We have the statistics.
Right.
Then you can get something done. So that would be an excellent, excellent thing to do. There are a myriad of projects, especially in the Kansas City area. I know that there are people giving away food in terms of food pantries. There was a call that came out from a pastor in Caldwell, and he asked, literally, can somebody come and help us unload 5 pallets of food to give to hungry people? So there are those kinds of opportunities, too. And let me ask you something. Do you think that it would be helpful if there were a resource on the internet to say, on this day, whether you have an hour or you have an entire day, that you can devote yourself to this effort, and here's how to get in contact with the people that are doing it?
Oh, yeah. I think me speaking on behalf of a lot of other people my age, I think that would be really helpful because, it's kind of like, very specific situations as you described. And if you don't know, a lot of people that are doing a lot of things, sometimes you're just kind of stuck. So, yeah, I think that would be really helpful, actually. Yes.
Okay. I'm going to try to do that. The NAACP has a website. It's www.monaacp.org. create a separate page for volunteer opportunities or put it on the calendar. I'm not sure which. I have to talk to the web guy about that. And start getting more of those out there. Because, we hear about them. And unfortunately, and listen, I believe everybody needs food to eat.
Right.
But in the NAACP, much of our work gets devoted towards policy-oriented solutions. And so you may see some NAACP people or units providing that kind of service in terms of food to people or other things like masks. But by and large, we are at the state capitol trying to get legislation passed.
Right.
We are in the courthouse. And when all that doesn't work, we're in the streets and providing support. Now, let me just throw in a word here. We have an 800 number. It's 844-NAACP HELP, just HELP. And so if you were to type that number in, you could do a number of things. If you're a protester and your rights have been violated or you've been treated unfairly or you just got a ticket and you're looking for help on getting that resolved, call that number, and we will do our best to get you connected with lawyers that will help if there's a criminal issue related to the protest, or if you've been abused, your civil rights have been violated, you've been discriminated against, or get this, someone who has been discriminated against, and you're looking for a good way to get that resolved. Sometimes people want to get involved, but don't want to be that direct pinpoint, that catalyst for change. So if you know about something, you should say something at that phone number.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. That's very helpful. So I just have one last question, and it's kind of related to all of this. So another question that we got from a lot of suburban kids is, we're learning now after the fact that a lot of the history books have it wrong. So, and that leaves a lot of people kind of feeling like, their basis was not correct. They grew on kind of shaky ground in regards to what they believe and, the history that they learned. So, in your expert opinion, what are some of the best resources to be educated on current and past injustices so that someone is not misled about what's going on?
Sure, absolutely. So, and I'll tell you, from the African American perspective, if you were to look in the Crisis magazine, like say I'm having a crisis spelled the same way. It's produced by the NAACP. It's available online as well. It comes free with a membership. It has current and up-to-date civil rights issues as they're occurring, like the issues that we see about the ability for people to vote. That is a fundamental civil rights issue, and although it's been going on a long time, it's like there are new chapters in the book being added every day. So that would be a really good place. If you were to look at Blavity, of all things, which is a online resource, they do a very good job of keeping up with some of the civil rights violations, particularly on an individual level. Now, they have some pop culture stuff in there, too, like about a celebrity that did or said something stupid. But they also carry, the good news as well.
Yeah.
Now, for historical context, you could start with Up From Slavery by John, it's Higginbotham, Dr. Higginbotham. He was also a judge. So that is a very good book. You could read Stamped, which is also really good. There are a ton of different resources available there. I know that Howard University has a good list. So if you were to Google Black History Howard reading list, you could also do the same thing with Harvard and Yale. Some of the things, like I have a friend who told me, and this is a very educated person, a doctor, an ER doctor of all things. He says, I grew up in rural Missouri, and I didn't know about Juneteenth. I'd heard that it was some sort of a holiday. I did not know that that was a celebration related to the emancipation of the slaves, 2 years after the fact, so that the people in Texas would be free.
Yeah.
It's hard. We've got to demand that our public schools do a much better job about
educating
having an inclusive history.
Yes.
And I think in that advocacy, we will come across lots and lots of historical facts and information that it all goes together. I mean, it's like making a stew. If you just put potatoes in, then you may not be happy with your stew. But if you put potatoes and you have some meat and you have some other vegetables and maybe a couple of spices, it's going to be much richer. And the context of it, just like that stew, is going to be thicker and meatier, if you will. Right now, with the history lessons that we get with, Christopher Columbus and I can't imagine that we ever celebrated that. But I do
Right.
remember being a kid, and my mom as a teacher, she was quick to point, yeah, he brought sickness and illness that killed millions,
Right.
right? And everybody else. Why would we celebrate that? And then enslave people as well.
Right.
So, and that also will help us shape our perceptions too. So I know that that's a long-winded answer, but there are many, many resources. And here's something. If anybody has a specific question, like, hey, what's the one thing or 5 things I can read, they can feel free and email me, and I am just at Nimrod, Nimrod, Chapel, CHAPEL, JR @gmail.com. That's an email address I use for the NAACP, and would love to get people connected, and so we can make that happen. And I left out something. I'll tell you, a lot of these civil rights organizations, we are older people. I just turned 50 this year, and so that puts me, I don't know how I got to be this old, but I'm damn sure here, and I like to pretend like I understand social media. I understand aspects of it, but I'm still not sure what to do with Instagram.
Yeah.
So, for people that understand that, that is a valuable resource that could be done in a very COVID-safe way.
Yeah.
But you could, whether it's posting stuff or establishing accounts or working with people so that they understand how to better use it, that is something that the NAACP desperately needs in so many different communities, but also many other organizations. So that would be huge. This podcast is an example of innovation and leadership in a way that many people in my generation, we just, this is great information. It's going to go to a ton of people, and it's got capacity to be shared much more than a flyer would. But we understand mostly how to do a flyer, and that's if we're really good. So this kind of work is essential for the way the community and the state and the world is moving. We'd welcome with open arms anybody who can help with that.
Well, thank you very much. That's very great information. And, all ways that Mr. Chappell just listed, are free. Calling and reading about things, that's something that you can do without having to donate money. And again, one of the most valuable things that we have is our time. And, you basically just said, volunteering is one of the biggest ways to help too. So thank you so much for all of the information. I feel like I have just learned so much more about this topic and about what's going on right here in Missouri. I feel like a lot of kids kind of think, well, this is only happening on the coast. This is only happening in the big cities. It's not really happening here. But I mean, just to hear you speak on what's happening right here in Missouri, I mean, we got to take action and we got to read and we got to get moving on things. So thank you so much for just your information. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Can I tell you about one other thing that's not commonly known?
Yes, go ahead.
So we have our own Floyd George here in Missouri. His name is Tory Sanders. 3 years ago, on May the 4th, he took a wrong turn out of Kentucky and ended up in the Boot Hill of Missouri, southeast Missouri, right outside of a little town named Charleston, Missouri. Ran out of gas. Called his mom, said, "Mom, I'm out of gas. What do I do?" He was 28, but he just, okay, call your mom. I have to do that.
Yeah.
And she says, "Well, find an officer. They'll help you." They didn't. The first time he located some officers at a gas station where he was just trying to get some gas in a can to put in his car to get to some other location to get some money from his family at a Walmart, I believe. They didn't help. The second time, they put him in protective custody. Now, that's different than being under arrest. Protective custody is when they say, well, you're a danger to yourself or other people. They then took him to jail. He hadn't been booked or charged with any crime.
Wow.
And they held him. That was at 10:14. At noon, they had a mental health professional that came in, examined him, took 12 minutes and said, he's fine. Let him go. 6 or 7 hours later, the sheriff, Corey Hutchison, went into Tory Sanders' room after he changed his clothes, put on riot gear, with 10 other law enforcement who had shields and helmets. They had batons, and they beat and they pepper sprayed Tory Sanders, and they tased him repeatedly. It was so thick in the jail with pepper spray that they had to leave the building while they left Tory Sanders in that room gasping for air. At the end, Corey Hutchison had his knee on Mr. Sanders' neck, and after 3.5 minutes, one of his coworkers said, "Hey, why don't you move your knee so I can get a pulse?" And he literally told his coworker, "This is what the testimony is, that I'm good, bro." And so he left his knee there. Torrey Sanders had handcuffs on. He never moved of his own volition again. He died in that cell. No one has been charged. The Attorney General for the state of Missouri, Eric Schmidt, said that he would look into it, and I believe that he is, but it's been weeks. The state governor, Mr. Parsons, has failed to take any stance or even mention this as a civil rights issue, as a law enforcement issue, or a violation of this man's right to justice and human dignity. This is another case that needs to be heard and needs to be resolved so that Mrs. Sanders, his mom, and Torrey Sanders' wife, and his children can have some rest and know that the people who caused this harm have been held accountable.
Yes.
They haven't been charged with the crime. So that's one that I think everybody should know about.
Yes. So we have Governor Parsons' number already, 573-751-3222. But can you please give us any other numbers that we should be calling to demand justice for Torrey Sanders, please?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We want to call the Attorney General's office, and that too is 573-751. And I'm pulling that up right now just to make sure I give it to you absolutely right.
No, it's fine.
And of course, the Attorney General is Attorney General Eric Schmidt, who, like Josh Hawley, has talked about justice being something that's available for everyone, but has failed to deliver that. I talked with him, and he has said that because the investigation's already done, the Highway Patrol and the FBI completed an investigation and determined, as in accordance with the death certificate, that this was a homicide. So it's inexplicable why no one's been charged and why it would take so long.
Right.
His phone number is 573-751-3321. And if people were to call and ask for the Attorney General to do one of two things: prosecute the 11 people who participated in Torrey Sanders' death, or call for a federal prosecution of Torrey Sanders' killers. Either one of those things would be appropriate and fine, but it's time for justice. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you. I will, if you don't mind, I will make a tweet right after this interview, because, that's something, again, we had no idea about, so thank you for bringing that to light. And I will definitely, I'll make a phone call today, actually, to the Attorney General and to Governor Parsons. So thank you so much for your information. Thank you so much for your light. I just appreciate you. And again, I feel like I have learned so much. So thank you so much. And, everybody, I will have all of the links to the things that he listed and to his email, so that you can get into contact with him if you have any questions. Thank you so much, Mr. Chappell. I appreciate you. And wow, just thank you.
It's been great, and it's been an honor to be with you on this podcast. And if there's ever another opportunity, please allow me to do so again.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of So You Grew Up in the Suburbs. I'm Anahi.
And I'm Olivia.
And we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye-bye.